Welcome to my podcast, All Things Agriculture. I'm your host, Eric Carey, and thank you for tuning in. On this podcast, get to know those who work in agriculture on a daily basis. Find out what they do, the challenges and opportunities they face, and what they think the future holds for agriculture. You'll also have a chance to hear what they do for fun when they aren't working hard to feed the world. If you're watching on YouTube, please consider subscribing to my channel and leaving a thumbs up and a comment below. If you prefer the audio version, you can listen for free on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Breaker, Pocket Casts, and Radio Public. And if you'd like to get in contact with me, please email me at allthingsagr@gmail.com. Thank you and enjoy the episode. Hi everyone, welcome back to All Things Agriculture podcast. I am your host Eric Carey, and I am pleased to be joined by Amanda Jones. Amanda, how are you doing?
Good. How are you, Eric?
Good. Thanks.
Thank you for having me today.
Definitely. Thanks for making the trip. You kind of did a little stop on your way back through from Western New York with you and Lars, so I really appreciate you taking the time to stop in and see me.
You're welcome. We're familiar with the drive, though. I mean, we spent enough years in Ithaca and then growing up in Western New York that we're pretty familiar with the drive, so it's no problem.
Probably isn't much of a... Do you take 90 from Batavia, like all the way to Albany and go down to Connecticut, or how do you usually get back to Connecticut?
Yeah, so normally we just take the thruway. So my family's in Western New York, and we now live in Connecticut. So you can take the thruway all the way east to west, and then go south on Route 8 to get back home. But then today we'll take Route 17, so the southern way, southern tier.
Okay. Yeah, hopefully I'll get you out of here before the snow starts hammering us. So don't want you guys getting stuck halfway there. So, but anyway, so yeah, I guess why don't you get started in on, where you grew up and, where, and we'll just make our way through and go ahead.
Sure. So I guess if we go all the way back to the beginning, I grew up with horses, so I'm a little bit of a diversified guest for you. I grew up horseback riding and in 4-H programs, and this was back in the Western New York area. So I grew up in a town called Batavia, and then we were surrounded by a lot of farmland, a lot of dairy farms, which honestly I probably didn't appreciate how many dairies were in that area, but just because I was so engrossed in the horse world growing up. But I grew up with a couple of horseback riding, equines, so I could do English and Western, and that really sparked my interest in ag and eventually programs for college. I guess growing up in 4-H, we were exposed to Cornell very early on for a lot of career development or summer camps that happened back in Ithaca, and that is what sparked my interest in applying for college and applying for an ag program. And initially I thought I would be in veterinary medicine, but definitely not in veterinary medicine today. It's a little different.
Yeah, so I guess even jumping back before Cornell, so English and Western riding, What's the difference between those two styles?
I guess the most common way to differentiate would be a Western saddle, right, has the horn, and an English saddle doesn't. So if you're explaining to people who might not see horses every day, that's the easiest way to differentiate. But stylistically, the English is a sleeker saddle, and those horses are the ones that would go usually jumping. They're usually a little taller, wider horses. They move faster. They have longer gaits. You might diversify into something like dressage, jumping, so how fast you can do a jumping course. Sometimes it's cross country, so the courses are out in fields instead of in an arena. And then where I tended to gravitate towards was Western. And these are the saddles, like I said, with a horn. They have a little bit more leather to them. The horses are typically a little bit shorter and stockier, on the stockier side, and they come right from all the Old West movies where these horses would be working with cattle, and they had to be very agile, have some cow sense to them. They evolved into what you call Western pleasure horse today, where the horses, that discipline is based primarily on how comfortable the horse is to ride, how smooth the gaits are, nice rolling lopes in the instance of Western. And so you can do everything from cow horse to pleasure riding, and then I ended up getting into reining most recently, which is where you can do various patterns on the horses with different speed, cadence, and precision.
You still ride horses?
More casually today because I don't have a horse of my own. So I had sold my horse before going off to college, and now that I'm kind of out of school, starting to casually look at what a horse would be look like for me to actually own. So hoping to get back into it, but until then, I've really just been doing lessons and more casual riding to keep the interest there, but also not have something to take care of every day yet.
That's a whole different. I've never ridden a horse in my life.
Well,
I've ridden a cow. Never
we'll get you
a
on
horse.
a horse. You'll probably stay on longer.
You get a really friendly cow. They don't really care, but yeah, I think it'd be cool to ride a horse. Like I said, I've never done it before. I think it would. They're pretty. I guess a horse is kind of like if you're really anxious, and do they kind of feed off you? Or if you're calm and cool and collected, they're going to be calm, cool and collected. But if you're anxious and jumpy and wiry, they're going to get anxious as well.
Yeah, they tend to pick up right on the mood of the rider. A lot of it is because, when you communicate with a horse, it's usually through your reins, and the reins are connected, between their mouth where the bit is and your hands. And then you're sitting on their back, and so, of course, your legs are communicating with them. And if you have a really timid or anxious rider, they're going to be more uptight, they're going to squeeze their legs, and they're going to be more apt to put pressure on the bit, even if it's, subconsciously. It's just, because the body's tense from being nervous. And horses will pick up on that. Some horses, will then be a lot more agitated because they're uncomfortable and they're not really sure what the rider is asking for. And then on the opposite spectrum, you might have horses that are, a lesson horse that's specifically meant to teach someone how to ride. And those horses have seen a lot of new riders over the years, and they are really good teachers, and it really depends on the horse's personality. But it is amazing to see that opposite spectrum with a good lesson horse that can, kind of take care of the rider, even though the rider is asking the totally wrong thing. But the horse will get, has a lot of forgiveness and will help to make that individual comfortable and eventually teach it to ride. And then, when you get into a lot of the competitive horses, these horses are so well tuned in with their riders that communicating is very subtle. So like I mentioned, I got most recently into reining, and we used to describe how we communicate with those horses. They're just like a 4x4 box. And so if you have your hand in the center of the mane, you should only have to move your hand 2 inches left, right, up, and down to control that horse. It's very subtle because they're so in tune with what the rider needs.
Really? Mm-hmm. How long does it take to form that sort of relationship?
Years.
Wow.
So they often say, a horse is kind of at its training prime if it's been trained consistently, from the time that it's 3 years old. The horses are usually in their prime between 6 and 8. So quite a few years to get to that really high performance level.
You almost have to grow up as a pair to hit that? Or can you, let's say you got a horse that's 5-6 years old and you first time and you start training with it, it still will take that long period of time to form that? It's not like the horse will, you tell them, oh, this is how if you have a horse that you're in tune with and I get on it and say, just do this, this, and this, it's going to realize that I'm not you, right? And it's not going to respond to anything I do.
I think, again, it goes back to the horse and what kind of personality and how much they've been exposed to something that's outside of just the norm of showing. So if they've been exposed to something like trail riding to do that in their leisure time, they're going to be more apt and comfortable taking on a new rider because they're used to new experiences and seeing what's going to be asked. And then it also depends on the rider too. So if you have a really nice, well-diversified rider, they may get on a horse and realize that each horse's needs are different. And sure, the longer you ride the same horse, the better and better they will get. But you learn to pick up again on those cues and how the horses are behaving, how they move, how comfortable they are with their body, and how responsive they are, and kind of cater your riding to each different horse. And I guess the best example of that is actually when I was in college. So they have 2 different riding programs. One's for collegiate and one is for high school riders. But the Intercollegiate Horse Show Association, that acronym is IHSA. We used to ride in college, and it's catered for individuals that don't have a horse because oftentimes, like myself, you sell off your horses before college because you don't have time to ride them anymore. They are an expense. And these riding programs offer a different perspective. And so instead of purely judging on the ability of one horse and rider who's been working together for years to reach a competitive level, you take that consistency of having the same horse out, and now you ask for the rider's ability to ride different horses and compete on a horse that they have just had about 5 minutes to get to know in the ring. So that was a really fun way to show horses, because it made myself and a lot of riders more aware of their own style and their ability to pick up, like you said, on each horse and how different they are, and ask them to reach their best potential, for every show that you were at.
Huh. So you were the Cornell team you were a part of, the Western team.
Yeah.
Would you guys have your competitions, were they all throughout the state, or were they at Cornell, or how did a lot of that work?
Mm-hmm. So it depended by region how much you really traveled. For Cornell, we were in the southern region, and we would primarily compete only at one other facility, and that was Alfred University. Alfred had facilities and horses for a Western program right at their university, and so we could travel there. Everything was provided. The disadvantage is that the home riders, those that were already at Alfred, already knew the horses, and so the visiting teams often had a little bit of a disadvantage, but we actually placed very well throughout the years that I rode. The English team at Cornell, which I did not ride on, but they did travel to more different diversified facilities, because on the English front, there were more schools that had English facilities, jumping facilities, and just more options to travel there.
Yeah, I never thought about that, how when you travel, you don't take your horses, they stay. So yeah, you're relying on wherever you're going. Like you said, you have to get to know them real quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never even thought about that. That's gotta be a hell of a challenge to
It was a
hope
fun...
they don't give you the bad horses. They could do that, but
Yeah, it was a fun challenge. Like I said, I think that it allowed each of the riders to grow, myself included, and a lot of my friends. We could recognize the difference, because your comfort zone is taken away, so now you have to learn to adapt and ride. And then the judging is different, so instead of judging on the horse and rider, the judges, the criteria is much more catered to the rider, so you have a level playing field there. But there were instances where, like you had brought up, having a bad horse or a horse you just didn't get along with. There were ways to ask for a reride if a horse was having a really off day, or if something caught their attention that you could clearly tell was not the rider's fault.
So I guess more into when you're at Cornell. So like you said, you came into Cornell originally as a pre-vet, going for vet med, and then so I guess you ended up going an entirely different path. So I guess why don't you talk about your journey through that?
So I entered in as a pre-vet student, and I will say my coursework didn't take me in a very different path, because right when you go in as a pre-vet, there's kind of a specific course load that they ask you to take, and that's because if after those 4 years of undergrad you're going to apply to vet school, there are so many different prerequisites between biology, chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, that you have to have in order to make those applications. So it took me probably really until my third year at Cornell to realize that I wasn't going to be a candidate for vet, and that I wanted to do something different. But the reason for that was through some of the other experiences that I received at Cornell and that I was fortunate enough to participate in. And so one of those was participating in research, and really that's what I do today, is I was able to take my animal science background, my interest in animal research into today, I'm working at a pharmaceutical doing human health research, but it was really all of my background in agriculture and animal research that got me there. So interestingly, that research also was linked with horses in the beginning. So I had a work-study job at the equine treadmill at Cornell's vet clinic, and first of all, that was really exciting to me as an incoming freshman, because I was like, oh gosh, I get to work with horses every day, this is the perfect job for me during my classes and coursework. So it got me to have a little bit of experience in the clinic there, and how the vets were diagnosing the horses and their conditions. But the veterinarians that were also working at that equine treadmill were doing equine research and applied research for the race horses. And so that really, it kind of sparked my interest to see and start asking those questions of why. And I just found that throughout my years at Cornell, instead of finding myself doing like hours at a vet clinic, I would instead be like in the research lab. And eventually, when it came time to apply for vet school, I said, I don't think this is for me, and I started to look at alternative options.
So that treadmill research, and you literally, it was, I think I saw it, I walked there, you were telling me about it, and literally she's just trotting along
Galloping.
Galloping, yeah. What the correct terminology.
Yeah.
So what exactly were you, like you said, for racehorses? Were you looking at the stride, or what? I guess what were you looking at more in detail?
So at the equine treadmill, what that treadmill and what that equine clinic is known for is actually the upper respiratory system. So absolutely, you could use the treadmill to look at gaits and lamenesses in the horse, but usually you can diagnose those lamenesses from the ground and not need a treadmill to do it. But for particularly race horses or performance horses, a limitation is if those horses cannot breathe properly. And it's been found that if you think about your upper respiratory tract, so that would be where your larynx and esophagus meet, and how air enters the airway, there can be a lot of both inherited and just damage to the larynx that will make it more difficult for the horse to breathe, and that can be a huge compromise in their performance. So the veterinarians that were working at that clinic were very in tune to diagnosing and then treating those upper respiratory diseases. And then they had a couple of research programs that they would apply to the horses that were in those racing situations on the treadmill in order to enhance their performance and allow them to perform better on the track.
So were these horses actual race horses, like people, like you go to like Batavia Downs or whatever, they have these are actual animals that they brought in? Was it they just wanted them to get checked out, or they thought they weren't performing to their standards? I guess what was their reasoning?
So a lot of times horses that have a respiratory problem, you can hear it. So a rider can say, oh, my horse is, they call it roaring, because they have a really raspy breath when they're breathing. So usually there is a reason to look into the upper respiratory tract. And there are two ways that you could test this out in the horses. One is by bringing them to a facility, so the vets are always at Cornell. You can bring the horse to them, and that could be both thoroughbreds and standardbreds. So the horses that you ride on the back, and the horses that pull the buggies, like you would see at Batavia Downs. So both of those might come to Cornell, and then on the opposite spectrum, those vets could go out to race courses, and as horses are exercising and practicing on the race course, they could evaluate them on the course. But of course, then you need availability of the vets to travel. But the key factor with all of this is that you have to have a video that you can put up the respiratory tract in order to watch the airway and what it's doing, and we call that an endoscope. So we use endoscopes every day in people if you need to look inside the esophagus or look down your trachea to diagnose something internally. And because the horse's respiratory tract, and they have such a long nose, they have a really long nasal tract, the endoscope can fit in there, and then if you put the endoscope through their nostril, it will come up at the top of their forehead and land right so you can see the upper respiratory tract. And so that way, it's remote, it's fitted to the horse's halter. You can watch the upper respiratory tract while the horses are running. And then we would ask those horses to run on the treadmill and simulate a race speed. And so you go from a walk to a trot to a canter and up to a gallop, so that you can really watch and record what the respiratory tract is doing. And then the vets could watch that back in like a slow mode replay to see exactly where the problems were.
Wow. Who would have thought? And something. So if you find something wrong, and you guys can fix it most of the time, or you can at least tell them, you have a way of going in there and addressing the issue. What kind of performance do they see? Like a big jump and just the horse has more stamina, or is that typically what happens after you fix it?
More stamina, absolutely. Usually the corrections were a surgical procedure where the vets could just go in through a small incision at the side of the neck and put it like a simple suture in to keep the airway open or closed, and make some really easy adjustments, but it was a short surgical procedure to correct it. But there were two primary different upper respiratory diseases. So one, like I mentioned, is called roaring, where you can really hear the raspiness, and that's when part or usually one side, but sometimes it can be both sides of the upper respiratory tract, they start to collapse. So that can be fixed with what they call a tie-back surgery, where that half of the larynx that is collapsing, they tie it up so that it can stay open. And that's a more subtle improvement in performance, but it's really for the comfort of the horse, so that they're not having such a hard time breathing. The other really common diagnosis that we got was called displacement of the soft palate. So in humans, if you touch the top of your mouth, you have a soft palate. And in horses, it's backwards. So their soft palate is actually on the bottom of their mouth. And in these horses that have what they call displacement of the soft palate, that cartilage becomes very, very fluid-like and lucid, and it will actually flip upwards in their upper respiratory tract. And when that happens on the racetrack, those horses just stop because they can't get any air into them. So that can also be fixed with a surgical procedure, but that's really where you would probably see the biggest performance benefit, because now, it's really, well, your horse is running or it's not. It can get air or it's not. And by tying that back in place, that could have a huge benefit for the horses.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I guess, you just watch horses race and you don't even think, you don't even think about their, taking air in. It's just, you don't even realize that there's, it kind of blows my mind. I had no idea. I guess I remember talking to you about when we were in school.
Yeah.
You said you had cows on treadmills.
Horses on treadmills, not cows.
Wow,
that would be really fun to see a cow on a treadmill, though.
I think the cow would just lay down and just give up.
Yeah.
But it's I guess I never went into depth with you about what exactly you did, so that's cool. We had a neighbor who has horses, and this is kind of just a funny side story. Our cows got out because cows are outside. They went through a fence and they went through a hedgerow, through another small field. Well, by the time we found out that the cows had gotten out, they had gotten into the pasture with the neighbor's horses. And it was so funny because there's probably like 50 of the 200 some odd cows, probably 50 of them are in this pasture, these horses. And the horses are just like running with ease and like, they look like these graceful animals. And then you get these cows who are, it's like they look like the mutts of the, like the underlings.
Yeah, they're not so graceful.
Yeah, and I think the horses are just like, who are these, what are these creatures, these nasty looking things? And it's just really funny to see the contrast of how cows run and how horses run. It's not even close.
Yeah. Well, their legs are a little longer. They're built to move, so.
Yeah, what's the max speed of a horse? Or does it depend on the breed?
I mean, a thoroughbred would have to be it depends on the distance. So a thoroughbred would be the fastest, but I don't have that trivia fact to know mile per hour. Probably around 30 miles per hour. But a quarter horse is a different breed of horse, and they are the fastest over a short distance, so a quarter of a mile. And
they can't sustain it, but they can just, it's like a difference between a long distance and a sprinter.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, if you look at how those breeds are built, quarter horses are short, stocky. They have huge hind ends to propel and give speed. And then the thoroughbreds are more slender, sleek, and they can go for distance and long endurance.
You got the big, what are the ones with the
and then the draft horses.
Yeah. Did you ever work with any of those before?
A little bit. So actually going back to where I got my start in agriculture and horseback riding, my grandparents also had Clydesdales growing up. So I used to drive the Clydesdales at our county fairs. The Clydesdales are the Budweiser horses with the big white feathers on their feet. And so that was a really exciting way to get into horses, is to drive them at the county fairs. But then it's funny how all of this comes full circle. So there's a couple different breeds of draft horses as well. And I told you earlier that for the performance on the treadmill, we used to use standardbreds and thoroughbreds, and those were really the primary fast racing horses. But a lot of these disorders of the upper respiratory tract were also seen in a draft horse breed called the Belgian. So Belgians are those really pretty blonde draft horses. And for some reason, there's a genetic link, and you can really see how prevalent the upper respiratory tract diseases are in Belgians and then these race horses, and they don't really know why that is. It's a very different style horse, different style work that they do, but prevalent in both of those.
Could be some sort of common ancestor from umpteen years ago.
Could be a common ancestor. Definitely there's a genetic link, but why that genetic link is specific in those breeds and not others is really hard to understand.
Huh.
So
yeah, I've learned a lot about horses in the last 15 minutes. That's cool.
They're more than hay burners.
yeah, that's what I've always, my dad had, is a picture way back, we had a horse, and I know my dad always said once tractors came out, my grandpa was more than happy to let the horses stay in the barn. go out with tractors. But yeah, no, I've learned it. Wow, that's really cool. Now I'll definitely have to take one for a ride sometime. Have to hop on the back of
Yeah,
one of
new
them. So.
appreciation.
Yeah, that's. I think they're cool. Just the power and the speed.
Yeah.
That vision of you riding it. I think I'd probably look pretty awkward and goofy being so tall. But
Get a tall horse; it'll fit your body and it'll look less awkward.
Well, the taller it is, the farther I'll fall, and the more I'll break something.
We'll find you a good safe horse to start with.
So I guess moving on. I guess went through Cornell, graduated, and then you end up going on to grad school. So out in Colorado.
Well, grad school is at Connecticut still, at UConn, and I did what's called a postdoc in Colorado.
Okay.
But if we want to go in order, we can't leave Cornell yet.
Okay. Yeah.
Because really my interest in research stemmed partly from what the research that we were doing clinically at the horse treadmill, but also I spent a couple of summers at calf farms, right? So I do have an appreciation for cows too and the work that goes on at the dairy farms. But working at a calf farm was an interesting experience because in those situations, right, you have all of these calves that are raised in the same environment and they grow differently, right? You've probably seen this at your farm. So you have calves that, right, they come from different mothers, but they're essentially raised in the same way. They're fed similar diets. And then the calves, right, they're treated and weaned at similar ages, but they all grow differently. They all have different fertility rates. And so there's definitely... Right. Again, I found myself asking the question, why? Why do these animals grow different if they're all in the same environment? So that's really what started to propel my interest in research and going for a graduate school and research career instead of veterinary medicine. And so I remember writing my applications to grad school, and they would say why do you want to do research? And I said, well, I like asking the question why, I like being able to solve that, and everything that I've learned in animal science and agriculture, I want to propel that through and do some additional animal research. And the lady who I was interviewing with, she was like, well, that's perfect because the grad program that, you're interviewing for, we are going to study what we call maternal programming. And that's trying to understand how what happens before an animal is born impacts its growth and development once it is born. So that's really how I say I fell into research that way, but, kind of serendipitously how all of our career tracks, connect in some way throughout life, but that's really where I fell into research.
So you were, what you end up going on doing was looking at in utero then, and while the animal's still in the uterus, looking at how the impact. So I guess go ahead and jump into that. I'm really
there's
interested.
Quite a few aspects to it, but I mean what it boils down to is this term that we refer to as maternal programming, and right, it's present in humans. You can see it every day in individuals and in women. It's present in the livestock industry. But the concept is that different stressors that happen, or maybe positive things that happen during a pregnancy, they happen to the mom and then can influence the in utero growth. Once those babies, lambs, calves are born on the ground, right, they grow differently, and a lot of it has been attributed and associated to what the stress was in utero. And so what I had started out researching was how maternal nutrition can affect the growth and development postnatally. And there was already a growing body of literature to what happened, for example, in sheep. If you fed a mom too much or if you fed her too little, so you simply call that overnutrition or restricted feeding, those lambs would be born usually smaller, but they would then grow up to be bigger, and we would call that catch-up growth. And the problem with this catch-up growth is that when they grow up to be, a little bit bigger than their counterparts that might have been born at a more average body weight, they would put on a lot more fat content than lean content. And so in livestock, that's a problem because now you have less lean product, right? You're growing fatty meat, and that's not in a marbling way, in a way that you have all the fat right around the muscle fibers and not within the muscle fibers. So it's makes for a less quality product when those animals and the carcasses go to slaughter. And then on the opposite spectrum for humans, it's a huge problem because that's how people end up with metabolic diseases and obesity, is that they're putting on more fat and not enough lean mass that is insulin sensitizing and can help your metabolism that way.
So maybe you aren't saying this, but there's an argument to say that in humans, some people are more prevalent obesity, and it could come back to the nutritional consumption of the mother when she was pregnant. That's a
Yeah. So there's a lot of clinical studies now in pregnant women where, right, a woman who's already obese or who might already have type 2 diabetes, women who might have a fatty liver disease, their offspring, so their children, are much more likely to go on and develop obesity, type 2 diabetes, those liver diseases, independent of even having and trying for a healthy lifestyle. So right there, that's still a really big black box. You go from like one generation to another generation, and we're not entirely sure how that can carry through so strongly between generations, but it's a lot of what we think subtle changes that happen to how your body develops, and it learns to develop either in a environment that's providing nutrition properly, or that has excessive nutrition, or that might be restricted and very thrifty. Those cells in the body are somehow programmed to respond and store those nutrients differently postnatally, and it can lead to all those further down complications. Like I said, there's lots of things that can intervene, like a healthy lifestyle or medication throughout your life, but that generational aspect is very, very clear in the literature and in the evidence.
I mean, it makes sense when you think about it, because as time goes on, the percentage of obesity, especially in the United States, increases, and the amount of childhood obesity increases. So it's almost, you can't say what's the correlation. You can't always look at, was it correlation cause?
Yeah,
doesn't
cause and
always,
effect.
Yeah. And it's, it probably is kind of on the same sort of uptrend, isn't it? It would make sense that something as that would maybe not fully cause it, but play a role in that.
Yeah, it's interesting to go back and see like where this field developed. So it actually goes back to the Dutch hunger famine. So when the Dutch were in a shortage for food, and a lot of those individuals, they could go back and look at the records for individuals, women who were pregnant during that time and women who weren't, and then they could segregate out if those women were famished during that famine, right, the lack of food, starting from when they were in early pregnancy all the way through, or if that started partway through their pregnancy, so the latter half, or if it was really for the last trimester, the last third. And that was really the foundational population observation that got this field started, because depending on, again, the length and duration of when the nutritional deficit in this case was, those offspring, so those individuals, would have a different prevalence of cardiovascular disease and obesity. And what they think happens is that, in utero, when any animal or individual is developing, early on in life, or early on in that fetal life, is when your muscle fibers are starting to develop. And your muscle fibers go through this process, both primary and secondary myogenesis. And the primary myogenesis is laying down these scaffolds of muscle fibers, and you need a certain number of scaffolds so that then you can build around them with secondary myogenesis, right? And so our muscles, all of our muscles are made up of these long muscle fibers instead of really small round cells like other organs in the body. And once you have these scaffolds and you can build around them and just continue to add muscle fibers, that's really important. But that process is regulated during early, mid, and late gestation. And then once you're born, you don't get any more muscle fibers. So that is your total muscle fiber number for life.
Okay.
And those muscle fibers can grow and get wider in diameter, but you can't really add any more. They can become more dense in nuclei and more dense in mitochondria, but you can't get any more. And so they think that disruptions in that early part of in utero development, when that primary myogenesis is occurring, that's when you start to have individuals that are more and more susceptible to like insulin problems, because they have less lean mass to respond to. And then you have individuals on the other end of this where they might have had a nutrient overload or deficit during just the last part of the trimester, so the last third. And this is important because in the last third of pregnancy is when growth happens. So, a fetus has spent so many, days, weeks, months developing the cells that it will need, and now they can finally grow during the last third of pregnancy. And it's during this phase where, if you have insults, that's when you tend to get the fetuses, the lambs that are born, they're born too small, and then they have the catch-up growth because they feel the need to, catch up to where they should be, maturation-wise.
Huh. And and like you said, a lot of that goes on. That's mostly more fat than lean tissue growth.
Yep, unfortunately.
Huh. So I guess as you did your research at UConn, that's what you were looking at in sheep. Sheep doing that, and just sheep, or were you looking at other small ruminants or?
So at UConn, we were mostly in sheep research, and that was for a few different reasons. For the specific field of maternal programming, and also for like the biomedical, for translatability to humans, sheep are like the desirable model. So pregnant sheep in particular are a really good model for humans because their pregnancy is a similar length. So 5 months compared to 9 in women. And that might seem like there's still quite a disparity, but then if you think about some of the other animals that you can use for research, they're even shorter. Like if you go back all the way down to a rat or a mouse, you're thinking about a 1 month long pregnancy. So sheep pregnancy-wise are more similar in length. The biomass ratio of how much the placenta and the lambs take up inside the mom is really similar to a woman and her child. And then sheep are more likely to have 1 to 2 offspring compared with women, who also typically have 1, sometimes twins. And then the other advantage is that by using the sheep, which are a small ruminant, they're pretty easy to manage, and so you can have a large flock, get a lot of information from your research questions.
So a lot of the research you were doing eventually could get passed on to human. Okay.
Yeah, so at UConn it was very much animal science focused. We were trying to come up with ways that we could educate and teach producers about how to best feed their flock, depending on the stage of gestation. And that came all the way down to like detecting pregnancy and using ultrasound techniques. And then, and we can come back to that in a minute, but to answer your question, when I finished at UConn, I really saw this huge value in the biomedical research and how we could apply what was going on in animal science to human health. And that's where I had pursued my postdoc out in Colorado, because they were doing very similar work also in maternal programming with sheep, but they were at a medical school. And so the people that I worked with in Colorado would take that information right back to their patients. And so I never saw patients, right? I don't have an MD degree, I have a PhD, but to be able to work with those people and see how your research was translating was an incredibly valuable experience. And that's really where I started to see everything that I learned in animals and in animal science applies directly to what we're doing, for all of the human health as well.
Must have been, does that happen often where you get to see your research be applied to humans, like, that quickly, and you get to, is that typical, would you say, in research, or are you kind of an anomaly?
I think you have to really seek those opportunities. I think in research it's really easy to fall into your office, basically just sit behind a desk, read papers, write about your research, and not really think about the applicability of it. It's really easy to kind of fall into that trap because also, you're worried about funding your research, you're worried about what's happening at the bench, and sometimes the priority to like go out there and really see either the patients or the farmers that are going to benefit, it's hard to find that time for. Or sometimes there are careers like in extension where those individuals are just meant to, work with the end user and then bring information back to a researcher, and it kind of becomes like a chain of information. So that was something that I saw and felt was really, really important to me, and that was what was driving me as a researcher. And so those were the careers and opportunities that I was seeking out.
Yeah, I think from a producer standpoint, sometimes you read some of the stuff that research people put out there and you say, well, that's not really applicable. Okay, that's cool, but it's not applicable. So it's nice to know that there's researchers out there who are following up and, really seeing how well it can be applicable and how well it works on farms. So that's encouraging to hear.
So probably one of the best examples that I had was when I was at UConn. I was really fortunate to meet with one of our cell ruminant veterinarians, and she was like, this research is so cool and valuable, but how am I going to go back to my, farms that I treat? And, she was also a specialist in sheep and goat. And so one of the things that I worked with her really closely on was on ultrasound in the small ruminants. Because if you think about this field of, maternal programming, again, you have to know that an animal is pregnant before you can even intervene and apply any kind of, benefit for their diet or any kind of awareness for how you manage the ewe or the cow while they're pregnant, and then manage the lambs afterwards. And so we spent a lot of time in the barn. We'd be in the barn 4 and 5 in the morning to ultrasound these ewes. And our whole purpose and interest was in how early we could detect pregnancy. And that field is really quite far along in cows. So you're probably thinking that, well, in cows we can detect really early pregnancy. We know a lot on ultrasound. The challenge with small ruminants is that you can't scan rectally as easily. Mm-hmm. And so you have to have, when you ultrasound sheep or goats, you have to ultrasound them from the side, from their abdomen. And the problem there with what I call this early detection is that when the uterus is small and you just have small embryos, the uterus is sitting right between the pelvis and it's nowhere near the side of the abdomen. And so we were doing a lot of work early on to track when we could start detecting the fetus and the embryo by ultrasound. And we had to time that with when we were predicting that the uterus would start to grow big enough and start to move over to the abdominal wall where we could detect something. And the reason, right, that the uterus moves over to the wall is because the rumen is on the other side. So you have to, right, kind of fit and move your organs around to make sure that you're detecting the right thing. But we spent many, many days in the barn, and we would just track when we could see a singlet or a twin or sometimes a triplet if there were 3 in the ewe. And then when you could detect what we kind of called these fetal hallmarks, because you couldn't detect a whole fetus quite yet. It was too early to see, the whole spinal cord. But we could track when you could see, all 4 of the feet. So they'd be 4 bright dots on the ultrasound. We could track when you could start to see the skull, because the skull, right, is a hard bone and bright on ultrasound, and so the eye sockets would be black. And so we kind of created this timeline of, okay, first you can see, one part of the fetus, then a couple days later you could see another part of the fetus. And so we were able to show that, if a ewe is going to be carrying more fetuses, so if you have 3 versus 1, you're more likely to obviously detect the pregnancy early because you have a greater chance, right? 1 in 3 instead of 1 out of 1. And then if you were to follow that ewe through in those first 45 days of her pregnancy, depending on which fetal features you could see on ultrasound, you could say, okay, this ewe was bred 20 days ago or 25 days ago, and really start to get an accurate breeding date on her. So we spent a lot of time, like I said, creating those fetal hallmarks. And that was something that, if we think about translating it back to the farmer, that was something that the vets could then take and apply and say, hey, I have a flock that I'm treating. I know that you just put them in with a ram. If we plan to scan 30 days after putting in the ram and 60 days after putting in the ram, then I can tell you this amount of information about your flock, and then you can start to manage them and apply the diets as we need, because you could segregate out the flock into, early versus late stage pregnancies.
Okay. So a lot of those hallmarks weren't known, or no one looked into it. I'm surprised it wasn't a well-known.
Detailed right in small ruminants. So if you look in all the dairy cattle research, it's there because you can go in rectally and it's really obvious. But having those early depictions in a sheep in a really specific timeline wasn't there. Part of the reason was because sheep are more of a hands-off management, and so if you have a ram running with your ewes and you go to get them scanned maybe 45 or 60 days after, you try to get everybody at once. And if you're pregnant, you go in one pasture. If you're not pregnant, you come back and get rebred. And they didn't pay a lot of attention to that. And then the other limitation was that the ultrasound probes just weren't good enough to have this early pregnancy detection. So you had to wait until ewes were 45 days along to get any information. But then it becomes a really small window, because 45 days in the old ultrasounds could see could see the lambs inside from a transabdominal ultrasound. But then by the time you got to 60 or 70 days of pregnancy in the sheep, now those lambs are too big and you can't see, you look and all you see is a rib cage. You can't see if there's 2 fetuses there because it just all looks like one. So it's a really, really fine window for trying to understand.
So it's just taking the time every day of just checking and scanning a lot of sheep.
A lot of sheep, a lot of data. So.
I knew a vet who would preg check. I asked him, obviously, you can't do it rectally. It's not going to work. And he said, you scan from the side. Yeah. Do you recommend with sheep producers, if they're carrying a single lamb versus twins and triplets, that they should be, do you ever think, the single ewes with just one baby should be in their own pen? And have you ever seen segregating based on how many lambs are carrying?
So if you look at the NRC, so the NRC like gives your nutritional recommendations. It's by a nutritional council, and they update it every couple of years for livestock, and they only separate out singletons versus multiples. So if a ewe is carrying one lamb, or ideally if a ewe is carrying one lamb versus a ewe that's carrying 2 or 3 or 4, then you just have those 2 pens, because that's all you have for nutritional information. But if you look really closely at the guidelines, where it's the most important is really that last trimester. So if you feed a ewe appropriately, whether she has one or multiples for like the first half to 2/3 of pregnancy, you're going to be in the right ballpark. But then in that last trimester is when these ewes are at the highest risk of what you call ketosis, right? So pregnancy toxemia or ketosis, which again you would see in your cows as well and be familiar with. The reason that ruminants in general are really prone to that, right, is because in their rumen, some of their carbs go to the microbes, and then when you have a pregnant animal, a pregnant ruminant, then another amount of nutrients has to go to the fetus, and then that can sometimes leave the mom in a starving state where they have to use fatty acids instead of glucose for their fuel source. And particularly in these small ruminants, pregnancy toxemia is really prevalent in that last third of pregnancy. One, because that's when the lambs are growing the fastest, so there's the greatest nutritional demand, which makes it really easy to create a deficit of nutrition. And then secondly, because if you have these ewes that have twins or triplets or sometimes quadruplets, there's also not enough space in that animal for the mom to have a full meal, so that makes it even more challenging for them to get in the amount of nutrition that they need. So really, if you have only one opportunity or one chance to change what you're doing with the small ruminants, it would be prioritizing that end of the third trimester, the end of pregnancy, to supplement them with some grain and not just hay or pasture.
Yeah, I never thought about that. I guess a body in terms of the size of the lamb versus the size of the ewe is pretty, especially if you have a quadruplet. That's you basically like their stomach, everything gets full and there's so much pressure. It's not full, but they feel full, I guess.
Right, there's no more room.
Yeah, cows don't have that issue.
Right.
Wow. Huh. That's kind of cool because having Nico on the last episode, we touched on a lot of lamb stuff. So this is kind of the same stuff, but just in a different aspect of it and more of the nitty gritties, which is really cool.
Yeah. And then like if someone like Nico who's really interested in the sustainability and the production aspect, they would come at it from the perspective of, well, they would really like to have 2 or 3 lambs per ewe because then they can grow their flock really more quickly, and then they have more lambs to market. And if you manage the pregnancies well enough, that's an okay thing. If you don't manage the pregnancies well enough, then you can end up in not as great of a situation later on because, like I said earlier, those lambs, when they're in utero, might not be getting the appropriate amount of nutrition. Then they end up growing to be maybe the same size, but their hanging weights are less. And so it was really that long-term cycle and making sure that, from conception all the way through when an animal, goes to a carcass, or maybe it goes back into a breeding situation or whatever it's going to do in life, it's that whole life cycle that you have to manage. It's not just from when it comes onto the ground.
So yeah, you have to be if you're trying to do the rapid growth, you have to be extra careful because you can kind of screw yourself if you aren't careful enough.
Right. And unknowingly, right? So this is why, as I mentioned, there's people like extension agents who will bring this information out to farms and try to come up with what the best plan is, because what we do in lab or what we do in a research, at a university under a research protocol, doesn't always directly apply or translate. You really have to look for those key talking points and key applicability points to help the farmers out.
So I guess moving on from that, Colorado was more the biomedical. So taking this information, but was it I guess what else did you do while you were out there besides just
in Colorado?
Yeah, I mean for for school and for fun or whatever,
Yeah, Colorado is a really, really fun place to be. If I had to pick anywhere to like move away from and be away from my family and husband, Colorado would be the place, and that was the place for me. The sunshine's out there, and there are endless possibilities for activities indoors and outside, and it's just a fantastic state. But I went out there, like I said, for my postdoc because I really wanted to see, everybody talks about this kind of buzz term of biomedical research, and what does that mean? How do I really take the information that I learned in animals and apply it to something that could also be in human health? And then they call this like the One Health Initiative and all the biomedical aspects. And so where I was in Colorado at the University of Colorado Medical Center, there was a really phenomenal research group that's also using sheep, but they had more of a metabolic and physiological approach to it. So rather than all of the applied research and nutritional research that we were doing at UConn, this got more into the nitty-gritty of, okay, which nutrients are important? When are they important? How do we even study oxygen and oxygen delivery in utero? And like I said, the facility that we were in, my advisor or mentor there was a PhD researcher, so she had gone through a very similar career path as I did, but everybody else in the building was MDs, so they were medical doctors, they were neonatologists, and they would ask these really hard questions that I would never ever have thought of and I would totally have overlooked in the past. And they're like, well, this is the information that I need to make a decision in the clinic. So this is, the outcome that I want you to encourage to put into your research, and not just simply come up and tell me, oh, they're different. They want to know what nutrient it is and exactly what unit you're measuring, and so how they can apply those magnitudes over to the NICU was really fascinating.
Wow.
Yeah.
Some in-depth stuff.
It was really, really cool.
And you were there for two years.
I was there for 2 years.
Wow. And I'm just trying to think. That's really in-depth stuff. It's kind of like when Andrew was here. It's just like you really gotta almost play it back and listen to what you say over and over again, because it'll fly over your head if you aren't paying attention close enough. So I guess I don't want to skip over anything, but you're Colorado, I guess, and then eventually you moved back to Connecticut. Is there anything else more you want to talk? I mean, we can go back and talk about like other things later on. We'll talk about things like do for fun, cool things you did out there. But
sure.
Come back to Connecticut and start working for pharmaceutical.
Yeah. So when I was approaching kind of, I don't want to say the end of a postdoc, because there's really no natural end to a postdoc, but postdocs are meant to be a time in your career when you can explore and get more interest and expand your skill set in a more niche area. So mine was in maternal programming. But when I started to look at positions, and I knew that I wanted to come back to Connecticut because that's where my now husband is, I was thinking that I would need to make this jump into human health, because that's really where a lot of the jobs were that were in the location that we would end up in. And so what I was able to do is take, from my maternal programming work, just like in animals, where if you have a really overweight mom or a really underweight mom, and they give birth to a lamb or a calf that's going to grow up and have some kind of altered growth later on because they're not growing as ideally. The same thing happens, like I said, in humans. And so I was able to leverage and kind of pivot from this idea of maternal programming, that all the biology is the same, and all the skills I've learned and all the basic concepts are the same. But now we are talking about taking and thinking about the progression of metabolic diseases in humans. And I could go at it from the maternal programming, where if you have an obese mom, they're more likely to become obese. But then if we also think about just the basic biology, it's the same. And I was able to leverage that as I interviewed and looked at positions here in Connecticut, and landed a position with a company called Boehringer Ingelheim, or BI is much easier to say, it's for short. And they're a human pharma company, that is also in the metabolic space. So they're interested in studying drug concepts that could treat obesity or fatty liver disease or diabetes. They also treat like cancer and have a couple other different fields, but I was in the metabolic space, and so I was able to make that transition, and really that whole career cycle coming back to what I was interested in for biomedical research.
So you happy with you think it was, I guess if you had to go back to, what was it now, 11 years ago when you walked onto Cornell campus, someone told me you're going to be working for a BI doing what you're doing, would you have laughed in their face, or would you say, oh, maybe?
I would have laughed, and I wouldn't have known that those jobs existed.
Yeah.
When you're young and you're applying to college, sometimes you don't realize how many vast career options and pathways there are, and also how no path is linear. right? They all bounce around and go back and forth, and somehow you can take some really small aspect from 5 years ago and apply it to what you're doing today. And so, right, it's just interesting how it all spider webs and goes back and forth, and it all also goes back to your network and who you know, and you just having an open mind to explore and see what's beyond the next door. So sure, I wanted to be a veterinarian when I started, and I'm sure that majority of animal science students, when they apply, they want to either be pre-vet or they already come from a farm background and they want to go back to their family farm. There's not a lot in between, but as you slowly get exposed to different environments and different clubs and different opportunities, you just grow for that appreciation, and you realize that there are many more options out there that you can look into.
I think it goes to show that agriculture is so broad.
Very.
And how it is interconnected with everything. And I think it's such a growth. I think a lot of people don't realize, you and I do, but it's such a growth potential in agriculture field is just, it's really limitless when you look at between research, production. It's a growing field. It's not shrinking at all. So
yeah, it's growing and it's becoming even more intertwined. You and I are talking specifically in animal ag today, but then you think about the crop science of it, and that could then apply to dairy and diet and nutrition, and then that feeds back into the maternal programming that I just talked about. So it all spider webs in so many different vast directions. It's incredible.
So many variables, and is that the most? Would you say that's the most? I've never done research like this, but would you say, is that the variables, just the amount of variables? Can that be frustrating when you're trying to get, you have your control and then you try to control variables, but you obviously can't control everything.
Yeah. Variability is challenging, and particularly biological variability, we like to put that term on it. One thing that I've appreciated my whole research career is I've been in what you call the in vivo research side, so working directly with the animals. And then there are individuals that work mostly or almost 100% at the bench, and you might call them an in vitro scientist because they're working more with like the cell assays. And when you're in these cell assays, you don't have variability because you're in a really controlled system, and then you try to put it into a whole body system, and then you get this incredible variability, and you have to explain it somehow. So I think it's definitely challenging, but it also lets you pull out like some really interesting relationships and study these nuances. Like if we go back to that example of the Dutch hunger famine, and you could have initially said, okay, these researchers wanted to just study pregnant women. They would have gotten such weird results and really inconclusive results if they just lumped pregnant women as a whole. They had to go look at that variability and how they could divide it up amongst the different stages of pregnancy to pull out something that was meaningful and conclusive. So it can be challenging, but it really encourages you to look at what you're doing differently.
Yeah, the sensitivity to, like you said, if you just lump it all into one, we'll just look at pregnancies, your information, like you said, when it makes sense, you really have to almost split the hairs, but in a way that is biologically meaningful. We know that if you just think about pregnancy, early, mid, and late are very different phenomena for both the mom and for what's developing inside. So yeah, this is the research is a whole different. I'm kind of glad I can't stand writing papers, so I would have never been able to do research. I don't think I would have been patient enough either. I'd rather just be out there with the animals. At least when I'm done for the day, I don't have to go home and write up any papers.
That's true. It seems like there's never an end there.
Yeah. That's. Do you still have to do a lot of writing and papers and all that? You still publish?
Yeah. So some of the work that I did in Colorado is still, we're writing those papers now. And then in my current position, we're encouraged to publish and what we can publish. A lot of times, like in my current position, what we might write up will get embargoed for a couple of years because, there's always a competitive edge for pharma companies. So they want to see you publish and put together a complete paper, and then they'll hold it for a couple of years before they release it out to a journal. So I think that there will be a lag in some publications for myself, but it's still, why do the research if you can't share it with somebody else? So writing is one way to do that.
Yeah. Is there kind of a, they're allowed to hold it for so long and then they have to release it sort of deal?
It gets all into, how the legal wants to handle it. So I don't know all the ins and outs yet. I've been at BI for just over a year, so I'm starting to learn, some of their some of the nuances and different considerations working at a private company compared with a university is definitely some differences.
Two different beasts. So I guess we'll get into more of what does Amanda Jones like to do for fun when she's not researching, and well, so what's kind of the things you do for hobbies and for fun? And
well, like I said, first of all, horseback riding. Right, it's always been a tried and true hobby of my own. Not riding as much these days as I used to, but like I said, we're starting to casually look for horses, and that'll be something to look forward to.
Lars is in on buying horses.
Yes.
If Lars is listening, maybe he has a different opinion.
Maybe we'll hear some commentary on that. So I mean, that's the deep hobby that I just absolutely love is horseback riding. But really anything outdoors, going for hikes. We were just hiking this morning before I drove down here to your place, and being outdoors. My husband, he is an owner of a vegetable farm, and so I think that is also, I wouldn't call it like a hobby, but that's something that in my spare time I'm then at the farm, helping out and have an interest in how, we're growing vegetables down there. But I would say I love adrenaline, so anything that's like outside and, gives you an adrenaline rush would be a lot of fun.
Like skydiving, bungee jumping?
I have never skydove, but it is on my bucket list.
What else is on your bucket list?
Skydiving is up there. I've asked Lars if he wants to skydive with me, and he's told me no, very firmly no. So I'm looking for someone to do that with.
It's is there a place right there in Connecticut you can do it close by?
I don't know. I honestly haven't looked that deep into Connecticut, but I think you said you wanted to go back to Colorado, so we can talk about Colorado for a little bit.
Okay, yeah.
And people in Colorado have like no fear. These people are incredible. They just have no fear. They want to go out. They want to adventure, whether it be hiking or people skydive like left and right because it's their activity for the weekend. And so when I was out in Colorado, my sister-in-law out there, she also is one of those like fearless individuals that just challenges herself constantly and in a really admirable way. And so I was like, if you can skydive, I think that I can skydive. I think it would be like one of those just like self-accomplishments that you think, it kind of seems unattainable. It's totally scary, but it's something that would be really cool to accomplish.
Colorado's it's like an outdoorsman person's paradise, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Like you can do anything. And even in the wintertime, depending on where you are, it's pretty, like you said, the sun's out and obviously Denver is going to be cold and snowy, but I've never been to Colorado, but I assume if you get down kind of on the flats, is it pretty decent weather-wise, or is it still cold?
So Colorado can get really cold, and even like on the eastern flat plains, it's extremely windy.
Okay.
So the wind can make it really, really brutal and cold. Denver, right, is just kind of like at the base of the foothills, and so you get some of the snow. We got a lot of hailstorms too when I was living out in Denver, weather-wise. But like you said, because it's, people are like, oh, you're high in elevation. Does that really matter? And I didn't think it mattered so much when I first moved out there and lived there, but now moving back to the Northeast, it's a very stark lifestyle as far as how much sun you get every day, and just kind of your the vitamin D deficiency in your mood is definitely different when you're in the Northeast compared to a place that just the sun is right there in your face all the time.
It's basically a storm comes through, it gets cloudy, and then the storm moves out, and it's bright and sunny.
Yeah, the storms move in and out. If we get snow, it melts in a day because the sun comes back out. So
you gotta take those vitamin D tablets.
But like you said, I mean, you can experience kind of everything out there. There's tons of, flat areas for farms. So you could drive up north of Colorado, and Colorado State's up there, and they have beautiful, beef pastures and feedlots up there. If you go south, then you end up in military bases, or if you go even further south, you end up in sand dunes or kind of like a desert area. And I never got a chance to go visit south very much, so I'd like to do that someday. And then if you go west, you go into the mountains, and so of course you have rolling foothills, you have beautiful trails, you have snow caps, you have 14ers, you have just so many options to hike or fish or go skiing in the wintertime. There is no shortage of outdoor activities.
Did you get a chance to go to parks and the Grand Canyon, all that, kind of out in the western? I know it's far away, but were you able to get out and see a lot of cool stuff?
I spent a lot of time in the Rocky Mountains. I never got out to the Grand Canyon. Probably my favorite was I have a lot of favorites. It was just a beautiful place. A few options though. When we were out, if you go out like to the Vail Aspen area, there's Hanging Lake, which is a beautiful hike, and the lake at the very top, it's really high in elevation, so you basically climb stairs the whole way to get there. But this lake is really remote, and they've tried to preserve it so that people can't like bring and leave a lot of litter there. The lake itself looks like a mirror. It's like this beautiful translucent blue-green color, and then all of the rocks, like it's like a mirror on the water compared to all the rocks that are there. So it's like if you take a picture and you have a reflection in the picture, but you can't really see it in the water. But here the water is so clean that you can see the reflection. So it's just an absolutely stunning.
So it almost looks like a mirror image, like 90 on a side.
Yep.
Why is it so clear? It's just because it's pristine. It's really clean.
It's pristine. I mean, it's quite a hike to get there. Like I said, it's almost like hiking stairs the whole way up. And then the state has done a really, really nice job preserving the area. So, like people, you can't just go up there and camp overnight. It has to be a day trip. They've gotten really limiting, so they limit the number of people that can go up each day. So there's less traffic. And it's also in an area of the mountains, right, where there's less pollution. You have to drive quite a ways to get there. It's up high in elevation, so it's kind of its own ecosystem up there.
Well, yeah, I've heard a lot of cool stuff about Colorado. I've never been out there, but it's I'd like to make a trip. It'd be a good place to try skiing too. Yeah. Did you ski at all out there?
I never got to ski while I was out there, and that's probably my biggest regret. I should have taken some lessons out there and seen the slopes. I went to a lot of the ski towns like while in the wintertime, but I never actually got on the skis up there.
Those must be cool. Those little ski towns if they're little, those ski towns must be kind of cool in the winter. Like they're just bumping, aren't they?
Yeah, they are bumping. There's, people take day or weekend trips up there. The breweries, right? It's kind of cool because there's tons of breweries, there's tons of places to eat, and it's all like outdoor seating. So even though you're in the middle of snow-capped mountains and it's pretty chilly out, people prefer to like to sit in their jackets and sit outside, like out on the patios instead of inside. So it's a really cool atmosphere, and you just people are out and about, walking around, going up to the slopes. So
yeah, the craft brew is like is that where it kind of the whole thing began? Don't they have like the most breweries like per capita or something like that?
There's a ton of microbreweries out there, and craft breweries. I mean, obviously there's the big breweries too, like Coors facilities out there, Budweiser's out there, but then all the microbrews left and right. You could just like make so many weekend trips out of that. That'd
be awesome. Yeah. And then you had is it true with the high elevation when it comes to drinking beer, how it hits you? They all say it hits you a lot harder.
Yeah, definitely. When I first moved out there, I could feel it.
So when I went to New Zealand in Lincoln, it's pretty common for the Lincoln kids at New Zealand to take classes or do a broad program in the United States at Colorado State. That's like, you go to New Zealand, you talk to New Zealanders, say, oh, I know someone went to Colorado State. That's like a lot of them go there. This one Kiwi I was talking to, it was a New Zealander
Kiwi.
You
call them Kiwis.
Yeah, Kiwis. I'm talking to him. He was an older guy. I think he was like a senior. He was a couple years older than we are. And I'm like, oh, what'd you think of Colorado? He's like, oh, it was a lot of fun. And I said, is it true what they say about the higher elevation drinking? He's like, well, I'll put it this way. First night I was in Colorado State, I went to a pub, and it was like 25-cent drafts. And he's like, I probably had 5 or 6 of those drafts. And he said, next thing I knew, I woke up on someone's doormat the next morning.
Yeah, it doesn't take nearly as many drinks to get
like,
there.
Wow. So I guess that's why I was curious to see if you don't have to go into any details. I just was wondering if you had the same sort of feeling that it hits you a little faster.
Moving out there, you definitely notice it. And then I could tell a funny story about my brother. He'll get a kick out of this when he hears the podcast. But my stepbrother lives out in Colorado, and when my mom and when his dad got married a couple of years ago, Jesse came out to visit us, and so he was coming from high altitude down to low altitude, and I remember being at the wedding, And, he's just taking shots of Fireball with me. And I was like, Jesse, let's take another shot. And he's like, dude, I can't even feel this. Like, I'm going to be so hungover tomorrow. And I've had so many drinks and I barely feel a buzz. So the opposite is definitely true as well.
There's a delay.
Yeah. So
Note taken.
it's funny. We always give him crap for that night.
I assume his next morning wasn't too good.
No, because he was still taking like all the same drinks, all the same sugar, and still had like a sugar hangover the next day, and but still didn't get as much fun out of it.
Fireball, ooh, it's a good Fireball's good with hard cider, and that's a good mix. But I'm not a big Fireball guy.
I'm not a big cinnamon person, but Fireball, I always enjoy a good Fireball shot.
God.
Yeah, we did Fireball shots before the wedding, so.
For yours?
Yeah.
Oh, that's another good question I wanted to ask. You had a very unique experience, I guess, with your wedding. What was it like trying to do a wedding in the middle of a pandemic?
Challenge.
I bet.
Yep. I've never. The best way to put it is I had never experienced anxiety before until planning this wedding during a pandemic. So I had a brand new appreciation for those that suffer like with anxiety and like not being able to sleep at night because there's so many things out of your control. But no, yeah. So to give some context, my husband and I, Lars and I, got married this past fall in September. Of course, and COVID is still very prominent. We were really fortunate in the way that we could make accommodations that were safe for our guests. So the wedding was at our farm, and so we had plenty of space to utilize to keep people spread out and outdoors. The vendors that we were working with were fantastic and excellent because, a lot of people had to cancel their wedding because the vendors themselves just couldn't support having a staff, right, if they weren't going to have regular events. But the vendors that we worked with were all able to make different pivots to keep their businesses open, and so like providing catering for us was something that they could still do. And really just everything was outside, and I kept telling everyone, it's outside, there's no rain plan, so bring an umbrella if it does rain that day. And we were really fortunate that the sun was out and it was just beautiful, and probably the best case scenario for us.
I had a fabulous time. I had so much fun.
I'm glad to hear that.
I think everyone had a blast just because it was like the first time we actually got to like people got together and you got to see people and hang out. It was a great time. I'm very happy you guys are able to pull it off.
Yeah, that, and then like we've talked about already, I'm a very science person, and so looking at some of the public health forecasts, and they said, well, really the positivity rate is going to be very low by August, September time, and that was really what we had to bank on, is that the positivity rate would decline far enough, and it was less than 1% in all of this, in both New York and Connecticut, which were where all of our guests were coming from. And so that was something that was really fortunate too, is that we just knew people were safe. We could provide the hand sanitizers and masks for people that forgot them, and just make sure that people were aware of what was going on, but also keep things outdoors and have a good time still. Yeah.
The facilities are like the barn and all that was basically brand new, wasn't it? That barn is really nice.
Yeah.
Really. Like I said, I had a lot of fun. So
that was a funny joke between myself and Lars's family, was that the barn was built, and I said, well, really, we can't postpone the wedding year because the barn would be 1 year older and a lot dirty and a lot more challenging to clean out.
Yeah, it was pretty full of stuff before the wedding, wasn't it? It was packed right full.
Yeah, that was a big task, but it paid off.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah.
It was I had a blast. I know everyone did, so
glad to hear that.
Yeah, glad I think there are other people who had weddings and they ended up canceling, so I'm glad you're able to
like I said,
make it work.
Circumstances were totally different for every for every couple, really. And so comparing the decisions one couple to another, you can't, because everything is so different.
Those variables.
Yeah.
Those darn variables. It all comes back.
It does.
So, I guess if you weren't doing ag, what do you think you would be doing? No horses either.
I thought about this because I was going to give like a horse answer instead, but that wouldn't have counted. No, so if I wasn't in agriculture, what I would love to do instead would be probably one of two things, but both would be working with the NFL. So I would love to be like a referee in the NFL. or a physical therapist and work with like rehab with all the players. I think either one of those would be really fascinating.
An NFL referee.
Yeah.
How did you come up with that one? That's a very, I would never guess. That's a very unique answer.
Well, I will preface this by saying I'm not the best referee. Like on TV, I still can't pick up on all the faults and penalties. But growing up, right, my brother played football my whole life growing up. And so whether we were in middle school, high school, and then even through college, I grew up watching him play, and just being in the football environment is something that I love. So I love watching sports. I love watching football, doing fantasy football, and going to games like, back when we could still do that. So I wanted, if I could do something different, I'd love to be back in that environment. And then I think being a referee is just something that has such a huge impact on the game that's where I would want to find myself.
Yeah, that's a cool answer. Yeah. I did not think of that.
And
then the sports, like a sports medicine type.
Yeah.
That kind of is.
Right, because that gets into my science background.
Yeah,
that gets into,
I can see that.
I love biomechanics. Like if we go back to talking about the horses on the treadmill, I just love the biomechanic aspect of it. And then to think about, helping players who are also high-performing athletes and how we can, improve, their day-to-day play would be really cool.
Yeah, it'd be neat to interact with some of those guys just to see. I think a lot of those NFL guys, they're like hitting the training, like they're doing therapy stuff basically 5-6 days a week just to keep them so they can play on Sunday. It's pretty rigorous.
Yeah, that, and then also I can remember when I was back at UConn, there's a researcher there's an institute that's based out of UConn, and these guys are working with NFL and also a lot of other athletic organizations on heat stress and the toll that heat stress has on their players. And so that I thought was like just a really fascinating way to combine science and then apply it then to the players that need to figure out how to cool their bodies during when they're running and conditioning in the heat.
I always thought it was funny when I was in like Pee-wee football when I was in 5th, 6th grade. Being able to drink like in a water break was like a reward for playing well. Yeah. And now, like, by the time I hit, like, varsity, it's like, go drink water. It was like they force you. I don't care. If you aren't thirsty, go drink water. It's just funny how, like, it was like when we were younger, it's like, oh, you guys aren't getting a water break. You got to keep going. And it was like, really, you're like dying. And I think it was just that whole shift of people realize it's probably good to stay hydrated so you can be at your highest. Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, or like even having like guidelines for like which practices you should wear pads on, or if like the temperature index is too high, playing without pads to keep the players safe.
Yeah, that gets very warm, those pads.
But you know what the cure is an ice bath. So if you get overheated, just get in an ice bath.
Cool your
temperature as fast as possible. Yeah.
That's the, I'm sure you probably know about there's an experiment you can do where if you take a bowl of ice water and you actually put your face into it and your heart rate will drop down.
I did not know about that
because
one.
There's I used to know.
Makes sense though.
It's your body's natural reaction. So they think like your body thinks you're in like a river, and so basically instead of pumping the blood out to your extremities, it's gonna pull everything back to your vital organs.
Like a drowning situation.
Yeah, or in a cold, it's freezing cold. You're hypothermia. Let's keep your vital organs going. And there's some sort of, can't think of the name of it, but there's a reaction. I remember we did that in biology 10th grade. Dunk your head into water.
Reverses all your blood flow.
Yeah, and your heart rate drops right down to nothing, and your blood keep you going. That's a cool thing. Like some of these people, they go underwater and they are in like a frozen lake and they sink, but some of them survive.
Yeah.
Which is I guess their heart rate slows so much where they don't die. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, physiology.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
So if you overheat, jump in an ice bath.
Yes. I remember there was like a very critical temperature. I want to say it was like 106 Fahrenheit. But if your body got above 106, right, that's when you started to pass out. And they would just say, if you can cool the body to 106, everything else will be fine afterwards.
That's, So if someone, and it also helps with the muscles, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. They'll pull the lactic acid out.
Muscle recovery.
So you aren't as sore. Yeah.
Or like now people go in those like cryo, they look like tanning beds, but instead they're cryo beds.
Oh, the cryo
they
chambers.
Just blow all the liquid nitrogen on you to keep you cold.
Yeah. Do you know Antonio Brown?
I know
played
yeah.
his feet. Do you remember that? It
No.
was so when he got picked up by the Raiders, he got traded from the. Was this 2 years ago? Or was it last spring? Anyway, he got traded from Pittsburgh to the Raiders, and he went into like a cryo chamber. I think it was 2 years ago. Yeah, it was before COVID. And he like frostbit the bottoms of his feet.
Oh, 'cause he was in
And
there
he
for
showed
too
up
long.
to training camp, and he's like, "Oh, I can't work out." And that was like the beginning of the downfall of him in Oakland.
Yeah.
That was like the first thing. Like they showed a picture, and his feet were all like crusty, and like
Yeah.
skin was coming.
He
It was
didn't
all
have a good time in Oakland.
No, I don't think he wanted to be there. He wanted to get to New England. Well, he got his wish in the end.
Yeah.
Got to be with Tom, so that's all he cared.
wanted.
That's all he wanted. So, but one more thing. You're a Bills fan, right?
Well,
Or you haven't converted to New England, have you?
no, definitely haven't converted to New England. No, I mean, I grew up in Buffalo, and so people by association say you're a Bills fan. My dad and so our family growing up was actually Steelers fans. And then I found myself, I would simply call it a Peyton Manning fan. So I followed Peyton to the Broncos and watched the Broncos for quite a few years. But I really was a fan of Peyton Manning and like his leadership and the way that he conducted himself and the way that he did football and was a team leader. So I found that's really where I think my team would be the Broncos right now.
Still the Broncos.
Oh, they've had a couple of tough years, but yeah.
Oh, you got to stick with them.
Yeah.
They might. They're in the runnings. They might try to pick up a quarterback this year. I don't know who, but
Yeah, but they did that the past couple of years too.
yeah. Ever since Peyton left, it's kind of been a revolving door.
Mhm.
But
Yeah, I saw he just got inducted into the National Football Hall
I
of Fame.
see that. Yeah.
So that was pretty rewarding to watch.
Yeah. He was a hell of a. Not the best playoff career, but regular season by far. I don't know what it had. He was one of those guys where he get in the playoffs and he would,
Yeah.
I don't know if you call it choke, but he just didn't perform to the same extent.
Yeah.
But yeah. Well, is there anything else you'd like to talk about while we're here? Or?
I don't think so. This was a lot of fun. Do you have any open-ended questions left?
I got one or two. You want me to
Sure.
give them one? All right.
Yeah.
One, if you could have dinner with any living or dead person, who would that be and why?
Be Peyton Manning, as I just mentioned. Yeah, Peyton, because I just am so fascinated with his leadership and the way that he's able to pull teams together. And like you said, he might not have always been the best performer, but if you look at him on and off the field, he's just like a phenomenal person. So learn from that.
And who do you think will win the Super Bowl next year?
Next year? I hope not Tom Brady.
He'll be 44.
Anyone but, right?
Anyone but, yeah. Boy, I don't know if he'll be able. Back to back is hard.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care who you are, but he's the last one who did it back to back. Go ahead.
I was gonna say it has been nice to see some new teams like coming up into the playoffs and into the Super Bowl, right? So even though I'm not a diehard Bills fan, to see them start to make a couple of playoff bids has been really rewarding. So.
Yeah, I agree big time. It's nice to see these other teams start to rise up. The stereotypical Patriots fell off, but they might be back. They get a quarterback, but I think Tom, though, he's getting to the point where he's really one nasty hit away from, like, I don't care how good he looks. He's kind of like Brett Favre, that whack against the New Orleans Saints, he wasn't coming back after that. Or Kurt Warner had the same thing. He got smacked, and that was
just something that's out of his control, no matter how healthy he can be off the field.
Yeah, I think Tom's to that point where he's old enough where he gets one nasty lick, and that'll be the end of it.
Yeah.
So hopefully not. I hope not. But it's just
no, you don't wish anything bad on
people.
No,
no, not at all. But it's just that's the reality of the game.
It's really trying to defy that aging, and aging is one thing, but then how your body handles hits is different.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, anyway, Amanda, I had a great time. Learned a lot, so.
Yeah, this has been fun, Eric. Thank you again. Yeah,
definitely. At some point we'll get Lars on, and maybe down the road I'll have you back on if I'm still doing this. So.
Sure, I'd love to.
But yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and thanks everyone for watching, and I'll catch you in the next episode.